break since about a week ago, but that's neither here nor there. But Russell wanted an audience, and I think we got some, so thank y'all for coming out. And so today we're going to have Russell's defense of his thesis. So Russell is my first grad student as a mentor that I've started and hopefully successfully complete here in a little while. So it was a little bit of a unique situation for he and I. I got a call from Dr. Owsley one day in about July or August, and he goes, "Hey, come down here for a second." And those of y'all know Owsley has kind of a scary phrase out of his mouth at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because you may not leave till 7. So I can say it because he's not here. But I'll give him that hard time if he was here. But I walked down there, and there sat Russell, and Russell was wanting to come back to grad school, and Russell's got a really unique and fun and background and track record. He's been at a couple of universities and a unique skill set in terms of undergrad degree, post-bac degree from TCU, U.S. Medicine School, and hopefully in a little while he adds Master's of Science to that distinction as well. So we came up with some project ideas, and this was an idea that I generated at a previous stop at an institution and fit his interests. From an AI standpoint, repro standpoint, specifically trying to compare the use of breeding box and a squeeze chute for artificial insemination pregnancy rates. So Russell will kind of tell you about those things a little bit and the results of his work that he has put together for this afternoon. So thank y'all for coming, and I'll let Russell kind of take over from here.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Oprah, and thank all of you for being here today. Today we're going to discuss my project that I completed as part of my requirements to graduate as a Master of Science here from Charleston State University. So, our world is growing. Every day more and more people are being born, and we're able to keep people alive longer, So, we have more people in the world, more mouths to feed, but these people aren't working in production agriculture. They're moving to urban environments. So we have more people to feed with less hands to grow and produce the food. So as producers, we have to come up with ways to better serve our consumers and provide in a long-term setting for those that are going to be consuming beef products. So how are we going to do this? And today we're going to talk about tackling this challenge through the use of reproductive technology. So what are some of the ways that reproduction impacts our industry? And when we have negative reproductive factors, how does that affect our bottom line? So the first is the loss in fertility is going to add a production cost to our herd with no economic return. So we're going to put all these inputs, all this time, labor, and most importantly, money into these cattle, and they're not going to provide us with anything in return. Secondly, when we have those cattle on the property and they're not providing us with any return, they're taking up land and taking up resources that we have that could be utilized by a reproductively efficient female. Third, if we have females that are fertile but are going to be delayed in their fertility and aren't as efficient as other productive females, they're going to bring in less income through a smaller, less uniform cap that is going to bring in less total dollars at the end of the day. And then lastly, Land and others in 2008 estimated that our loss annually is $4.7 billion, and all of that is accumulated through loss of reproductive efficiency. So this is a graph that gives us an example of our distribution of our operations within the United States as well as our distribution of cattle. So some of you may be thinking, why is this important? Why does this matter? And the things that I want us to look at are this first graph. So although only 10%, a little over 10% of our total cows and heifers that have calved are 1 to 19, almost 60% of the operations within the U.S. have under 20 cows. So, in most instances, these are going to be where we find our cases of mismanagement. So as researchers, we have to find ways to help them manage their cattle and find ways to make them more reproductively efficient. In most of these cases, these are not going to be self-sufficient operations. Therefore, they may not want to put the money and the investment into purchasing a high-cost bull. So how do we provide them the genetics to provide superior cattle so that they can provide high-quality cattle on their 10 to 11%? The way we're going to do that is through artificial insemination. So for those of y'all that aren't familiar, artificial insemination is simply the manipulation of the female reproductive tract and deposition of collected semen, cryopreserved semen from a bull. This is very useful in a lot of cases because it provides opportunities for producers to use genetics that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. If you stay on social media and you surf the internet, you don't have to look very hard to see the price that some of these bulls are selling for these days. So as opposed to paying $1 million for a bull, we can buy a unit of his semen for $50, and we can utilize that to excuse me, to further project his offspring. So in the literature, artificial insemination, as I've stated earlier, has been a great tool for us in terms of genetic improvement. It has allowed us to use those genetics from those high-quality bulls that we otherwise wouldn't have access to. And in conjunction with artificial insemination, we'll see the use of estrus synchronization protocols. And estrus synchronization is going to assist in our AI program because it's going to shorten that calving season through the shortening of a breeding season. So an example is we're going to expose more cows to bulls in a shorter period of time. Through that concept, we can have more calves born in a shorter window that will grow more uniformly and hopefully provide us more income at the end of the day. Our synchronization protocols are going to focus primarily on two different physiological occurrences: the onset of estrus, a standing heat, or the onset of ovulation. This is an example that was adapted from Larson and others in 2006 that's going to show us a little bit about the difference in an estrus detection, an estrus synchronization versus an ovulation synchronization. As we can see here, in estrus detection, we have to detect heat. So what that means is that someone has to be with those cattle at least twice daily, looking for cows and heifers in a standing estrus. With the timed AI protocol, we're going to time up their ovulation. We're going to expose all the cattle at one time and try to make sure that we can, and try to ensure that they all ovulate at once. As you can see here, at the end of the day, our percent pregnancy is not different. This is, again, these statistics were adapted from Larson and others in 2006, where they compared the use of estrus detection versus timed ovulation, and no difference was found. So some of our pros, and I've already talked about a lot of these, but a few other ones is we're going to minimize the use of those herd sires in our smaller operations. So a lot of operations don't have the means to house a bull. And if they do, the bull usually tends to be out with the cows year-round, and we end up with calves year-round. Some cons to AI that we really haven't touched on at this point is going to be increased labor. So a bull, you put him out, and he does all the work for you at that point. When we utilize estrus synchronization, we utilize artificial insemination, we're going to have to increase the amount of time we spend with those animals. When we increase the amount of time, we increase labor. If we increase labor, we're increasing costs. So in both situations, expense can be a pro or a con. It can be beneficial in some situations, and others it won't be worth it. Another con is we're still going to probably need a bull because, as you saw here, we only got 50 and 52% of our animals pregnant. So another thing that's going to go into the project we're going to talk about today is the effect of temperament on production and reproduction specifically. So temperamental cattle have been shown to be less productive from a general production scheme in terms of average daily gain, feedlot production, reproduction in females, reproduction in bulls. But more specifically, temperament has a negative effect on the on the impact of artificial insemination, as found by Cook and others in 2011. More specifically, that stress, the temperament, that stress response from temperament, cortisol, has been shown to negatively impact the GnRH receptors on the anterior pituitary. And then currently, there is no published data comparing the reproductive efficiency of the breeding box compared to a squeeze chute. So here I have the HPA axis, or a hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And the purpose of this is to explain to you the impact of stress and stress hormones on reproduction. So here we have, the first thing is we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to release a CRF, or a corticoid releasing factor, which is then going to stimulate ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, to be released from the anterior pituitary. This will then act back on the hypothalamus and on the adrenal gland to cause cortisol. And cortisol has then been shown to negatively impact the GnRH receptor affinity. So That was a lot. The two hormones I want you to focus on are going to be ACTH and primarily cortisol. We're not going to talk about ACTH throughout the rest of the day. We're primarily going to be looking at cortisol. So how does this affect reproduction? So here, most of you, if you've had me in class, you've seen this figure before. This is a hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And the purpose of this is to show the hormone interaction between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and the gonad. And whenever we introduce the adrenal gland and we introduce cortisol, what happens is cortisol is introduced and acts upon this anterior lobe of the pituitary, which is then going to block those receptors and postpone or completely shut off our LH release to cause ovulation. So how do we minimize stress? Well, it's been shown that if we select for less excitable cattle, that is inheritable, and throughout generations we can reduce temperament. Also, studies have been shown that if we alter our working facilities, that is more suitable to the cattle and their natural movement, and we can reduce the amount of stress. Also, if we properly train our animal handlers, and we have animal handlers that do not overstress or overwork and stress out animals, that is another means. And then the one that has been anecdotal at this point is the use of a breeding box to minimize the visual stimuli during breeding. So to this point, people have said, and people that have promoted the breeding box have said, we can reduce stress when breeding cattle through the use of this box. So if we minimize the amount of visual stimuli they have, we can create a quieted response. We can minimize the amount of stress they exhibit. But again, at this point, all of data is anecdotal, so nothing has been tested through research at this point. So what is a breeding box? A breeding box is simply a solid-sided chute that is completely enclosed and is going to, again, eliminate visual stimuli from the outside. So it's just a dark box that is enclosed on 3 sides and then on the top, and it allows for the AI tech to go in and breed the cattle. It does not have a squeeze component as compared to a squeeze chute. So again, this is a picture of one of the first breeding boxes that was created by Parson and Helfenstein in 1969. This is an example of our current breeding box and the way that they're constructed today. As opposed to wood, most of our breeding chutes are constructed out of steel, and again, they're solid-sided. This is a stationary, so this would have to be set up to a separate set of pins, as opposed to a portable. This breeding box can be backed up directly to a squeeze chute. And as you can kind of see here, it's solid-sided, and there's no squeeze, but it is V-shaped so that the cattle don't go down. So again, what is this for? Why are people using it? Well, people are intentionally using it to increase their conception rates, their pregnancy rates to AI. Again, as I've stated, we don't have any visual stimuli or squeeze mechanism. But does it truly impact our pregnancy rates? Do we have an increase in pregnancy rate from using this mechanism? We're going to look at that today. So our null hypothesis was that no difference in pregnancy rate will be present between females bred in a breeding box versus a squeeze chute. As you can see here, this is the breeding box that we utilized at R.A. Brown Ranch in Throckmorton, Texas, as well as the squeeze chute on that same ranch. So our objectives that we created to solve our hypothesis or disprove our hypothesis, the first one was to determine if a difference in pregnancy rate can be obtained when using a breeding box or a squeeze chute for fixed time to AI. The second objective was we wanted to look at the relationship between behavioral and physiological stress responses. So could we predict the physiological stress through a behavioral response? And then lastly, we wanted to examine if stress responses are different in pregnant females versus open females. So are our more temperamental cattle, are they getting more pregnant than our calm cattle? So for this experiment, we utilized 332 Boss Taurus females from 2 separate locations. One population of females came from Virginia Tech University in Blacksburg, Virginia, and a second population came from R.A. Brown Ranch in Throckmorton, Texas. All females were accustomed to handling and human contact prior to the experiment, and we randomly assigned restraint mechanism, with chute serving as control and box serving as our treatment. So this is a quick layout of the working facilities at R.A. Brown Ranch. The cattle come in from sorting alleys into a bud box, and once they're sorted from the bud box, we then assign treatment at this gate. They are randomly assigned to either the breeding box or the squeeze chute. The breeding box we utilized had 2 chutes so that we could put cattle in, and 2 cattle in at once But so that we minimize the amount of time that an animal spent in the breeding box, we chose to utilize one animal in the box and then go and breed the next animal in the chute so that we got the same physiological response. So this is a picture of the gate we used. As you can see, we open it, and if we open it, it goes to the breeding box. If we leave it closed, it goes to the squeeze chute. That's just an example of how it swings. So one man stood just on the other side of this pipe and would swing the gate, and they would let cattle in one of the two races. For our synchronization protocol, we chose to utilize the 7-day co-sync plus seeder protocol. This protocol calls for insertion of a seeder on day 0 as well as an injection of GnRH. 7 days later, we pulled that seeder and injected 5 milliliters of prostaglandin F2 alpha. 66 hours later, those females were bred on a fixed time to AI and administered a second dose of GnRH. So prior to breeding and immediately following breeding, we had to assess temperament in these females. We assigned chute score prior to breeding and exit score after breeding. We utilized a range of 1 to 5, with 1 being calm and 5 being excitable. That was developed by Boisnet and others in 1997. And we utilized a trained technician to assign these scores at both locations. So for our chute score evaluation, the parameters that we looked at were primarily movement within the chute. So was this female uncomfortable? Was she restless? Was she trying to get it? Was she trying to get out? Was she vocalizing? So was she vocalizing stress? And then was she heavily breathing? So was she behaviorally stressed out, what we would call stress? And then our exit score evaluation was very similar. We looked at the speed to leave, so how fast was she leaving the chute? We looked at her aggression towards handlers as well as aggression to get away from the facilities, and again, we monitored vocalization. So this isn't just a non-analyzed data that kind of gives us an idea of where the majority of our females fell in terms of temperament. As you can see here, the majority of our females were chute score 1, so we were working with fairly calm cattle. We have a few 2s and 3s sprinkled in with a minimal number of 4s and 5s. Our exit score frequency is very similar. Again, the majority of our cattle were very, very calm with a few outliers as a 5. So for measuring our physiological stress response, we chose to collect blood via coccygeal venipuncture immediately following breeding. That blood was chilled for 2 to 4 hours until it could be centrifuged at 2,000 RPMs for 20 minutes. We then pulled plasma supernatant and stored it in a micropipette tube at negative 20 degrees Celsius until it could be shipped for cortisol assessment. To assess our cortisol, we utilized the ELISA assay, specifically the Emulite 2000, and 30 days post-breeding exposure, we examined those females for pregnancy via rectal ultrasonography. For our experimental design, we chose to utilize a completely randomized design with location serving as our random effect and the individual female serving as our experimental unit and our observational unit. We analyzed all data using SAS version 9.4, and we utilized Proc-Glymics for the analysis of pregnancy by treatment, cortisol by treatment, and cortisol by pregnancy status. We utilized Proc-Core and Proc-Logistic for the analysis of stress response variables, and our alpha was set at P equals 0.05. So our first set of results that we're going to look at is simply our pregnancy rate by treatment. So pregnancy comparison of pregnancy in a breeding box versus a squeeze chute. Here on the y-axis we have our pregnancy rate, and on the x-axis we have our 2 different treatments. As you can see here, we had 57% in the box and 69% in the chute, and our p-value was 0.59. Therefore, we did not have significance or no difference